Hi, my name is Michelle, and last Christmas my father looked me straight in the eye, surrounded by our entire extended family, and said, "If you died tomorrow, we'd all be relieved." The room went silent except for the crackling of the fireplace, but what happened next shocked everyone more than his cruel words ever could. When I stood up and revealed what I'd been hiding for months, my golden child sister Jennifer's perfect world came crashing down, and my family finally saw who I really was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The December snow was falling steadily outside the windows of my downtown Denver apartment as I sat staring at the email that had arrived 3 hours ago. Christmas dinner at 4 p.m. sharp. Don't be late this year, Michelle. We have important family announcements to make. Love, Mom. The passive-aggressive undertone was classic Linda Martinez, my mother, who had perfected the art of making every communication feel like a gentle reprimand wrapped in motherly concern. I set my laptop aside and walked to the kitchen, where Tyler was making his famous hot chocolate, the kind with real melted chocolate and a dash of cinnamon that had become our Sunday tradition over the past 8 months. He looked up from the stove, his dark eyes immediately picking up on my mood. Tyler had this uncanny ability to read my emotions before I even fully understood them myself, a quality that had drawn me to him when we met at a gallery opening last spring. "Family email?" he asked, stirring the chocolate with practiced ease. His voice carried that gentle tone he reserved for conversations about my relatives, the one that said he was prepared to listen without judgment, while internally marveling at the dysfunction I'd grown up considering normal. "Christmas dinner," I confirmed, accepting the mug he offered. The warmth spread through my fingers, a comfort I needed more than I cared to admit. "Apparently, there are important family announcements to be made." Tyler raised an eyebrow, settling onto the couch beside me. "Let me guess. Jennifer has another promotion, engagement update, or life achievement to share with the adoring masses." I couldn't help but smile at his accuracy. My older sister Jennifer had indeed made a career of turning family gatherings into personal press conferences, each event carefully orchestrated to showcase her latest success. At 28, she was already a partner at one of Denver's most prestigious law firms, engaged to Kevin, who worked in investment banking, and living in a sprawling house in Cherry Hills Village that looked like it had been pulled from the pages of Architectural Digest. "Most likely," I said, taking a sip of the hot chocolate, though I have to give her credit for timing. Christmas dinner gives her the maximum audience for whatever earth-shattering news she's prepared to bestow upon us mere mortals. The joke fell flat even as I said it, the bitterness creeping into my voice despite my best efforts. Tyler reached over and squeezed my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm. This small gesture had become our shorthand for, "I'm here, and you don't have to pretend with me." "You know you don't have to go," he said quietly. "We could drive up to Vail, rent a cabin, have our own Christmas. Just us, some good wine, and absolutely no family drama." The offer was tempting, more tempting than it should have been. But running away felt too much like admitting defeat. And I'd spent too many years being the daughter who disappeared, who made herself small, who let Jennifer's light dim my own, until I'd almost forgotten I had any brightness to offer the world. "I need to be there," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure why. "Besides, this year is different." Tyler waited for me to elaborate, but I wasn't ready to share the news I'd been carrying for 3 weeks now. The news that would change everything, that would finally give me something to contribute to those family announcements my mother was so excited about. The irony wasn't lost on me that for once, I had something that would genuinely shock them all. The next morning, I drove through the familiar streets of Lakewood, past the strip malls and chain restaurants that had defined my childhood landscape. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. My parents' house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, a modest, 2-story colonial with red brick and white shutters that had looked exactly the same for as long as I could remember. The Christmas decorations were already up, of course, because Linda Martinez believed that holiday displays were a reflection of family values and neighborhood standing. The oversized wreath on the front door, the perfectly arranged lights along the roofline, the inflatable snowman on the front lawn that had been a point of contention between my parents for 5 years running. Dad thought it was tacky, Mom insisted it was whimsical. Mom always won these arguments, not through logic or persuasion, but through the sheer exhaustion she could inflict when she really wanted something. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the house and gathering my courage. Through the large front window, I could see movement inside, the familiar choreography of my family preparing for company. Mom would be in the kitchen, orchestrating the meal with military precision, while Dad held court in his recliner, occasionally barking orders about which football game he wanted to watch. Jennifer and Kevin would arrive fashionably late, making an entrance that suggested their time was more valuable than everyone else's. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda, my best friend since college, and the only person who truly understood the complicated dynamics I was walking into. Remember what we practiced. Deep breaths. You've got this. And if it goes sideways, I'm 20 minutes away with wine and escape plans. Amanda had been my anchor through everything this year. The friend who showed up when I couldn't get out of bed, who celebrated the small victories when no one else noticed them, who reminded me that my worth wasn't determined by my family's inability to see it. She was also the only person who knew what I was planning to reveal today, and while she'd supported my decision, I could tell she was worried about the potential fallout. I grabbed the bottle of wine I'd brought, a nice Pinot Noir that I'd splurged on because it felt important to contribute something meaningful, even if it would probably go unnoticed among the chaos of whatever Jennifer had planned. As I walked up the familiar brick pathway, I could hear voices inside, the sound of family gathering that used to fill me with anticipation and now mostly just made me feel tired. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her face lighting up with the particular smile she reserved for family occasions, the one that looked genuine unless you knew her well enough to see the calculation behind it. Linda Martinez was a beautiful woman at 55, the kind of put-together elegance that came from years of careful maintenance and the financial means to achieve it. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite having spent the morning cooking, her red dress festive without being ostentatious. "Michelle, sweetheart, right on time," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and vanilla candle wax. "Tyler couldn't make it?" "He's with his family in Boulder," I replied, handing her the wine. "They have their own traditions." This was only half true. Tyler's family had invited me to join them, a warm, chaotic gathering of professors and artists who talked over each other and laughed too loudly, and somehow made me feel more welcome in 4 hours than my own family had in 26 years. But I'd declined, knowing that today was something I needed to face alone. "Well, their loss is our gain," Mom said, though I caught the flicker of relief in her eyes. Tyler's presence always shifted the family dynamic in ways that made everyone slightly uncomfortable, not because they disliked him, but because his genuine warmth and interest in me highlighted their own emotional distance by comparison. I followed her into the house, breathing in the familiar scents of pine from the Christmas tree, cinnamon from whatever was baking in the kitchen, and the underlying smell of my father's cologne that had permeated the furniture over decades of habitation. The living room was exactly as I remembered it, furniture arranged for conversation that rarely happened, family photos covering every available surface, each one carefully chosen to project the image of domestic happiness. Dad was indeed in his recliner, though he'd made the concession of wearing actual pants instead of his usual weekend sweats. Robert Martinez was a man who had aged into his authority, his thick gray hair and lined face giving him the gravitas that served him well in his job as a high school principal. He looked up when I entered, his expression neutral in the way that suggested he was prepared to be pleasant, but not particularly engaged. "Michelle," he said, raising his coffee mug in acknowledgement. "How's the graphic design business treating you?" The question was asked with the same tone he might use to inquire about the weather, polite, but fundamentally uninterested in the answer. I'd been freelancing for 2 years now, building a client base that included several local businesses and a nonprofit that worked with homeless veterans. It was meaningful work that I was genuinely proud of, but in my family's hierarchy of professional achievement, it ranked somewhere below Jennifer's law career and above unemployment. "Really well, actually," I said, settling onto the couch. "I just landed a contract with the Denver Art Museum to design their new membership materials. It's a 6-month project that should keep me busy through the spring. This was actually huge news, the kind of career breakthrough that represented months of networking and portfolio development, but I delivered it casually, already knowing it would be overshadowed by whatever Jennifer had planned. Dad nodded absently, his attention already drifting back to the television where pre-game analysis was discussing teams he cared about more than his younger daughter's professional life. Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol arrived next, my father's brother and his wife who had driven down from Fort Collins for the occasion. They brought with them their daughter Emma, my cousin who was 22 and fresh out of college, with the kind of optimistic energy that suggested she hadn't yet learned how exhausting family gatherings could be. Emma hugged me with genuine enthusiasm, asking about my work with the kind of interest that reminded me why I'd always liked her. "Mom showed me some of your designs on your website," Emma said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "The branding you did for that coffee shop downtown is incredible. I had no idea you were so talented." The compliment caught me off guard, partly because it was unexpected, and partly because it was the first acknowledgement of my work that anyone in my family had made in months. I felt a warm flush of pride mixed with sadness that it took my young cousin to notice what my parents seemed incapable of seeing. "Thank you," I said, meaning it more than she could know. "I've been working really hard to build my portfolio." "Well, it shows," Emma said. "I'm thinking about going back to school for marketing, and seeing what you've created is really inspiring." Before I could respond, the front door opened with the kind of dramatic flair that announced Jennifer's arrival before she even appeared. I heard her laugh first, that carefully modulated sound that carried just the right amount of warmth to seem genuine, while maintaining an undertone of superiority that let everyone know she was the star of this particular show. "Sorry we're late," Jennifer called out, her voice carrying from the entryway. Traffic was absolutely insane coming from the country club. Of course they'd been at the country club. Jennifer never missed an opportunity to casually mention the exclusive venues that filled her social calendar, the kind of places that required membership fees and dress codes, and the sort of social capital that came with Kevin's family connections and her own professional success. She entered the living room like she was making an entrance at a gala, her long, dark hair styled in loose waves, her emerald green dress perfectly fitted to show off the figure she maintained through twice-weekly Pilates sessions and a personal trainer. Kevin followed behind her, tall and impeccably dressed in a way that suggested his clothes cost more than most people's rent. They looked like they'd stepped out of a holiday magazine spread, the kind of couple that made everyone else feel slightly underdressed and vaguely inadequate. "Michelle," Jennifer said, approaching with arms outstretched for a hug that felt more performative than affectionate. "You look great. I love what you've done with your hair." I touched my hair self-consciously, aware that I'd simply pulled it back in a ponytail after washing it that morning. Jennifer's compliments always felt like backhanded observations, comments that seemed positive on the surface but carried subtle implications about previous inadequacies. "Thanks," I said, accepting the hug and breathing in her expensive perfume. "You look beautiful, as always." This wasn't flattery, but simple truth. Jennifer had always been stunning, the kind of effortless beauty that made everything look easy and left everyone else wondering what they were doing wrong. She'd been homecoming queen, valedictorian, the girl who got into Harvard and graduated summa cum laude before returning to Denver to conquer the legal world with the same systematic precision she'd applied to every other area of her life. Kevin shook hands with Dad and Uncle Tom, falling easily into conversation about sports and investments with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. He was handsome in an expensive way, the kind of looks that came from good genetics and better grooming, and he treated our family gatherings like networking events where he could practice his charm on a friendly audience. Mom called us all to dinner 30 minutes later, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd orchestrated everything perfectly. The dining room table was set with her good china, the red and gold pattern that only appeared at Christmas and Easter, each place setting arranged with the precision of a formal banquet. The turkey sat at the center of the table, golden brown and perfectly carved, surrounded by dishes that represented hours of preparation and decades of family tradition. As we took our seats, I found myself in my usual spot halfway down the table, positioned where I could see everyone but wasn't quite central to any conversation. Jennifer and Kevin sat to Mom's right, the places of honor that acknowledged their status as the family success story. Dad sat at the head of the table, Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol to his left, Emma beside me with the kind of placement that suggested we were both considered the supporting cast in this family drama. The conversation during dinner followed predictable patterns, flowing from Dad's work stories to Uncle Tom's retirement plans to Mom's detailed analysis of the neighbors' recent home improvements. Jennifer and Kevin contributed observations about their own lives, with the casual confidence of people accustomed to being the center of attention, sharing anecdotes about their engagement party planning and Kevin's latest promotion with the kind of detail that suggested these topics were endlessly fascinating to everyone present. I listened with half my attention, the other half focused on the weight of the secret I was carrying, the news that would soon shift the entire dynamic of this gathering. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting here feeling invisible, while carrying information that would make me the center of attention in ways I'd never experienced before. "So," Mom said as she began clearing the dinner plates, her voice taking on the tone that suggested we were transitioning to the main event. "Before we have dessert, Jennifer and Kevin have some wonderful news to share with everyone." Here it was, the moment I'd been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. Jennifer's face lit up with barely contained excitement, the glow of someone who'd been waiting all evening to drop her bombshell. Kevin reached over and took her hand, the gesture practiced and romantic in the way that suggested they'd rehearsed this moment. "Well," Jennifer began, her voice bright with joy that seemed genuine despite its perfect timing. "Kevin and I have been talking about our future, and we've decided to move up our wedding date." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the anticipation build while she gazed around the table at faces that were already beginning to smile in anticipation of good news. "We're getting married next month in Aspen. A small, intimate ceremony at the Little Nell with just immediate family and a few close friends." The reaction was instantaneous and enthusiastic. Mom gasped with delight. Dad's face broke into the kind of genuine smile he rarely showed. Uncle Tom raised his water glass in an impromptu toast. Even Emma clapped her hands together with excitement, caught up in the romantic drama of it all. "That's wonderful news," Mom said, her voice thick with emotion. "A winter wedding in Aspen sounds absolutely magical." "It's going to be beautiful," Jennifer continued, warming to her subject. "We've booked the penthouse suite for the reception, and Kevin's parents are flying in their wedding planner from New York to handle all the details. It's going to be small but elegant, exactly what we've always dreamed of." The conversation exploded into questions about dates and venues and guest lists, everyone talking over each other in their excitement to be part of this announcement. I watched it unfold with the detached fascination of someone observing a play they'd seen many times before, knowing that my role was to smile and nod and offer appropriate congratulations while the real stars took center stage. "Michelle, you'll be my maid of honor, of course," Jennifer said, turning to me with the kind of smile that made it clear this was a generous offer rather than a given assumption. "I know it's short notice, but I couldn't imagine getting married without my sister by my side." The request caught me off guard not because it was unexpected but because of the timing. In 3 weeks, I would be standing beside Jennifer as she married Kevin in what would undoubtedly be a perfect ceremony, designed to showcase their perfect life to their perfect friends and family. The irony of this timing was almost too much to bear, but I managed to nod and smile and say all the right things about being honored and excited and ready to help however I could. As the congratulations continued, and the conversation turned to dress shopping and menu planning, and all the details that would consume the next month of our family's attention, I felt something shift inside me. The weight of my own secret seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, and I found myself wondering if I had the courage to share it tonight, or if I would continue to hide behind the comfortable invisibility that had defined my role in this family for so long. The answer came when Dad, flushed with pride and probably too much wine, stood up to make a toast. He raised his glass high, his face beaming with the kind of paternal joy that I'd rarely seen directed toward me, and began to speak about his daughters and the pride he felt in their accomplishments. "To Jennifer," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet dining room, "who has never ceased to amaze us with her determination, her intelligence, and her ability to make every dream come true. And to Kevin, who has won the lottery by gaining not just a wife but a family who loves him already." The toast continued for several minutes, each word carefully chosen to highlight Jennifer's achievements and bright future. I sat listening, waiting for some acknowledgement of my presence, some indication that this toast included both daughters rather than just the one who'd made all the right choices and achieved all the expected milestones. Instead, Dad's gaze landed on me with what I can only describe as dismissive affection, the look of someone acknowledging a disappointing but harmless presence. "And Michelle," he said, his tone shifting to something that might have been kindness if it hadn't been so condescending. "Well, maybe someday you'll figure out what you want to do with your life." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just been extinguished. Around the table I could see faces that registered varying degrees of discomfort, from Emma's shocked expression to Mom's attempts to smooth over the awkwardness with nervous laughter. Jennifer and Kevin exchanged glances that suggested they found Dad's assessment both accurate and amusing. But Dad wasn't finished. Whether it was the wine or the excitement of Jennifer's announcement, or simply the culmination of years of disappointment in his younger daughter, he continued with the kind of brutal honesty that families sometimes mistake for love. "Honestly," he said, setting down his wine glass and looking directly at me, "if you died tomorrow, we'd all be relieved. At least then, we wouldn't have to keep pretending that your little art projects and failed relationships are going somewhere meaningful." The silence that followed was absolute. Not the comfortable quiet of people processing good news, but the stunned stillness that follows a car accident or a natural disaster. Even the Christmas tree lights seemed to flicker in shock at what had just been said. I felt the words hit me like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. This wasn't just disappointment or frustration speaking. This was a father telling his daughter that her existence was a burden to be endured, rather than a gift to be celebrated. The worst part wasn't the cruelty of it, but the matter-of-fact delivery, as if he was simply stating an obvious truth that everyone present already understood. Around the table, I could see the aftermath of his words playing out in real time. Mom's hand had flown to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror at what her husband had just said. Uncle Tom was staring at his brother like he'd never seen him before, while Aunt Carol reached over to squeeze Emma's hand in a gesture of protective comfort. Jennifer's face had gone pale, though whether from shock or embarrassment at Dad's lack of social grace, I couldn't tell. But in that moment of absolute silence, something crystallized inside me. The hurt was there, sharp and immediate, but beneath it was something else. A clarity I hadn't felt in years. This was my moment. Not the one I'd planned or the one I'd rehearsed with Amanda, but the one that had been building for 26 years. Of feeling invisible, dismissed, and fundamentally unwanted. I stood up slowly, my legs steadier than I had any right to expect, and looked around the table at the faces of my family. My father, who had just revealed the depth of his disappointment in me. My mother, who had spent years enabling his emotional distance through her own silence. My sister, who had built her identity on being everything I wasn't. And Kevin, who had never bothered to see me as anything more than Jennifer's forgettable younger sister. "Actually, Dad," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room with surprising strength, "there's something you should know before you start planning my funeral." I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I'd been carrying for 3 weeks, the one that contained the letter that would change everything. My hands weren't shaking as I'd expected them to be. Instead, they were steady with the certainty that this was exactly where I was supposed to be, saying exactly what needed to be said. "I've been waiting for the right moment to share this news," I continued, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "And I think Dad just gave me the perfect opening." The envelope felt heavy in my hands, heavier than paper had any right to feel. As I stood there in the dining room, surrounded by the shocked faces of my family, memories came flooding back with startling clarity. This wasn't the first time my father had made me feel worthless, just the first time he'd been so explicit about it in front of witnesses. I was 7 years old when I first understood that love in our house came with conditions. Jennifer had just won the state spelling bee, and our living room was filled with congratulatory flowers and newspaper clippings of her victory. I'd come home from school that same day with the blue ribbon from our class art contest, excited to share my own small triumph. When I showed it to Dad, he glanced at it briefly before returning to his newspaper. "That's nice, Michelle," he'd said without looking up. "Maybe you can be an artist when you grow up. Someone has to make the signs for the stores where successful people shop." Even at 7, I'd understood the dismissal in his tone. the implication that my interests were somehow lesser than Jennifer's academic achievements. I'd gone to my room and hidden the blue ribbon in my jewelry box, never mentioning it again. That pattern had repeated itself countless times over the years. When Jennifer made varsity tennis as a sophomore, I made JV soccer as a junior, but only Jennifer's achievement made it into Dad's annual Christmas letter. When Jennifer graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, I graduated with honors from the University of Colorado, with a degree in graphic design. But Dad introduced me to his colleagues as our other daughter, the one who draws pictures. The weight of those accumulated dismissals settled on my shoulders as I looked around the table now. Mom was still covering her mouth with her hand, her eyes darting between Dad and me as if she could somehow undo what had just happened through sheer force of maternal will. Dad himself looked slightly surprised by his own words, though not apologetic. If anything, he seemed annoyed that I was still standing there, instead of accepting his verdict and retreating to lick my wounds in private. "Michelle, honey?" Mom began, her voice carefully modulated in that way she used when she was trying to manage a crisis. "Your father didn't mean—" "Yes, he did," I interrupted, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. "He meant every word. And honestly, Mom, so did you. You've both been thinking it for years. This is just the first time it's been said out loud." Jennifer found her voice then, though she still looked shaken by the brutality of Dad's declaration. "Michelle, you're being dramatic. Dad just had too much wine. He's emotional about the wedding announcement." "Am I being dramatic?" I asked, turning to face my sister fully. "Let me ask you something, Jen. When was the last time anyone in this family asked me how I was doing? Not how work was going or whether I was dating anyone, but how I was actually doing." The question hung in the air, and I watched as Jennifer's face cycled through various emotions before settling on defensive confusion. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to think of a single instance. "I'll save you the trouble of trying to remember," I continued. "It was never. In 26 years, no one in this family has ever asked me about my feelings, my dreams, my fears, or my happiness. I've been treated like a supporting character in the story of Jennifer's life, and when I didn't turn out to be the comic relief you wanted, I became the disappointment you tolerated." Uncle Tom cleared his throat uncomfortably, his face flushed with embarrassment at being witness to this family implosion. "Maybe we should all take a step back here. Families say things they don't mean when emotions are running high. But that's just it," I said, looking at him with genuine sadness. "This isn't emotions running high. This is 26 years of careful emotional distance finally being acknowledged. Dad didn't slip up and say something cruel. He said something true that he's been thinking for a long time." I turned back to Dad, who was now staring at his hands with the expression of a man who realized he'd crossed a line but wasn't sure how to find his way back. "Do you want to know the really sad part, Dad? I've spent my entire adult life trying to earn your approval. Every client I landed, every project I completed, every small success in my career was measured against whether it might finally make you proud of me." The words were coming easier now, as if years of suppressed thoughts were finally finding their voice. "I chose graphic design partly because I loved it, but also because I thought maybe creative work would impress you in a different way than Jennifer's academic success. I thought maybe there was room in your heart for two different kinds of achievement." Dad's jaw tightened, and I could see him struggling between defensiveness and something that might have been shame. "Michelle, you're twisting things. I've always supported your choices." "Have you?" I challenged. "Name one time you've asked to see my work. One time you've mentioned my career to your friends with pride, instead of embarrassment. One time you've treated my accomplishments as worthy of celebration, instead of polite acknowledgement." The silence stretched between us, filled only by the ticking of Mom's antique mantel clock and the distant sound of Christmas music playing from the kitchen radio. I could see in Dad's face that he was running through his memories, searching for evidence to contradict my accusation, and finding none. "I remember when I got my first paying client," I said, my voice softer now but no less firm. "I was so excited, I called you from my apartment to share the news. Do you remember what you said?" Dad's face had gone pale, and I could tell he remembered exactly what he'd said, even if you wished he didn't. You said, "Well, I hope they're paying you enough to cover your rent, because this family can't keep supporting your hobby forever." The words came out without bitterness, just exhausted resignation. My hobby. That's what you called the work I'd spent 4 years studying and months building toward. Mom made a small sound of distress, as if she was only now understanding the cumulative impact of years of small cruelties. "Michelle, we were just worried about your financial stability. We wanted you to be realistic about your prospects." "Were you worried about Jennifer's financial stability when she chose law?" I asked. "Did you encourage her to be realistic about her prospects, or did you celebrate her ambition and support her dreams?" The question was rhetorical, and we all knew it. Jennifer's path had been paved with encouragement and celebration from the moment she expressed interest in law school. Her LSAT scores had been announced at family dinners. Her law school acceptance had warranted a celebration dinner at the finest restaurant in Denver. Her first job offer had been shared with everyone Dad knew as evidence of his daughter's brilliance. "That's different," Dad said finally, his voice lacking conviction. "Law is a stable profession. Art is unpredictable." "Art?" I repeated, almost laughing at the irony. "Dad, I'm not a starving artist painting abstract expressionist pieces in a garret somewhere. I'm a graphic designer. I create marketing materials for businesses, design websites for nonprofits, develop brand identities for startups. It's commercial art, with real-world applications and steady income potential." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, turning the screen toward him. "I made $68,000 last year. That's more than a lot of people with traditional jobs, and it's income I generated through my own skills and business development. But you've never asked about my earnings or my client base or my growth potential because you've never taken my work seriously enough to be curious about its financial viability." The number seemed to surprise him, though he tried to hide it. I could see him processing this information, recalculating his assumptions about my financial situation based on evidence he'd never bothered to gather. "Furthermore," I continued, "next year I'm on track to make over $90,000, thanks to the Denver Art Museum contract and several other long-term clients I've secured. But instead of celebrating these achievements or even acknowledging them, you've spent years treating my career like an extended adolescent phase I'd eventually outgrow." Jennifer was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between surprise and what might have been respect. "I didn't know you were doing so well financially," she said quietly. "Because no one ever asked," I replied. "When you got your first associate position, Dad called everyone he knew to brag about your starting salary. When I landed my first major client, he told people I was still trying to figure things out." The truth of this observation seemed to hit everyone at the table simultaneously. I could see it in their faces, the dawning realization that they'd been operating on assumptions rather than facts for years. They'd created a narrative about my life that fit their expectations rather than my reality, and they'd never bothered to fact-check it against actual evidence. "It goes deeper than career stuff," I said, sitting back down in my chair but keeping the envelope clutched in my hands. "Do any of you know that I've been in therapy for the past 2 years, working through anxiety and depression that stems largely from feeling fundamentally unwanted by my own family?" Mom's face crumpled at this revelation, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "Honey, you never said anything about being depressed. When would I have said it?" I asked gently. "During our monthly phone calls where you spend 20 minutes telling me about Jennifer's latest achievements and then ask if I'm still doing okay before hanging up? During family dinners where every conversation revolves around Jennifer's life and Kevin's career and your friends' children's accomplishments?" I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. I felt like a ghost in this family for years. Present but not really seen, acknowledged but not valued, loved in theory but not cherished in practice. Emma, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Michelle, I had no idea you felt this way. I always thought you were just more private than the rest of us." Her words were kind, but they illustrated the problem perfectly. "Private," I repeated. That's a nice way to describe someone who's been systematically excluded from meaningful family connection. You thought I was private because I stopped trying to share important parts of my life with people who consistently demonstrated that they weren't interested. I turned to Jennifer, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable as the focus shifted to family dynamics that had benefited her for so long she'd stopped noticing them. "Jen, do you remember my college graduation?" Her face flushed slightly, and I could tell she remembered exactly what I was referring to. "You're talking about the restaurant incident." "I'm talking about the fact that my college graduation dinner was cut short because you had a law school interview the next morning and needed to get home to prepare. We'd been at the restaurant for 45 minutes when you announced that you really needed to leave, and instead of staying to celebrate with me, the entire family left to support your preparation for something that was still just a possibility." The memory still stung, even after 5 years. I'd spent 4 years working toward my degree, maintaining a 3.7 GPA while working part-time to help pay for school, and my graduation celebration had been abandoned so that Jennifer could go home and practice answers for questions she might be asked the next day. "That wasn't personal," Jennifer said defensively. "That interview was really important. It was for Columbia." "And my graduation wasn't important?" I asked. "The celebration of 4 years of hard work and academic achievement wasn't worth protecting from your test prep anxiety?" I could see her struggling to justify the decision that had seemed so reasonable at the time but looked increasingly selfish in retrospect. "I was nervous about the interview. I needed to prepare." "You were always nervous about something," I said quietly. "And your nervousness always took precedence over my celebrations. Do you know how many of my achievements have been overshadowed by your anxieties or your announcements, or your schedule conflicts?" The question was met with silence, which was answer enough. I could see in Jennifer's face that she was beginning to understand the pattern I was describing, the way her needs had consistently been prioritized over mine, until it became the family's default operating procedure. "I'm not saying any of this was deliberate," I continued, my voice gentler now. "I don't think anyone in this family woke up and decided to make me feel worthless. But intent doesn't erase impact, and the impact of 26 years of benign neglect has been devastating." Uncle Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I could tell he was wondering whether he should try to mediate or just wait for this confrontation to run its course. Aunt Carol was holding Emma's hand tightly, her maternal instincts activated by the emotional intensity in the room. "I've spent years in therapy learning to recognize my own worth independently of your approval," I said, looking directly at Dad. "I've built a successful career, developed meaningful friendships, and created a life that brings me genuine happiness. But I've also carried this constant ache of knowing that the people who are supposed to love me unconditionally have never really seen me as someone worth their attention or pride." Dad's face was difficult to read, cycling between defensiveness, guilt, and something that might have been recognition. "Michelle, if we made you feel unwanted, that was never our intention." "I believe that," I said sincerely. "But Dad, intention isn't magic. Good intentions don't erase the impact of years of emotional neglect. They don't undo the damage of growing up feeling like a disappointment in my own home." I stood up again, still holding the envelope that had started this whole conversation. "Which brings me to the news I came here to share. The announcement that I thought might finally give me something to contribute to our family's narrative of success and achievement." The room seemed to hold its breath as I looked around the table one more time. These people who had shaped my entire understanding of love and worth and belonging, who had given me life but struggled to give me acceptance, who had provided for my physical needs while starving my emotional ones. 3 weeks ago, I received a call that changed my life," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "A call that validated every risk I've taken, every creative instinct I've followed, every professional choice that you've questioned or dismissed." I opened the envelope and pulled out the letter inside, unfolding it carefully as everyone watched. The letterhead was immediately recognizable to anyone in the creative industry, and I saw Jennifer's eyes widen as she processed what she was seeing. "This is a contract offer from Morrison Creative Group," I said, holding up the letter. "They're one of the most prestigious design firms in the country, with offices in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago." They've offered me a position as senior creative director with a starting salary of $140,000 plus benefits and profit sharing. The silence that followed was different from the earlier uncomfortable quiet. This was the silence of people processing information that completely contradicted their assumptions about reality. I could see Dad's face cycling through surprise, confusion, and what might have been the beginning of pride. "They've been following my work for months," I continued, "ever since my Denver Art Museum campaign won a National Design Award that I never mentioned to any of you because I was tired of sharing achievements that wouldn't be celebrated." Mom's hand flew to her chest, and I could see her mentally calculating the significance of what I was telling them. A six-figure salary at a prestigious firm wasn't just professional success. It was the kind of achievement that demanded recognition even from people who'd never valued creative work. "The position would require relocating to their Chicago office," I said, watching their faces carefully, "which means that after Jennifer's wedding next month, I'll be moving halfway across the country to start a new chapter of my life." This seemed to hit Mom the hardest, and I could see tears forming in her eyes as the full implications sank in. Not only had they underestimated my professional success, but their dismissive treatment of me was about to result in my physical absence from their lives. "But here's the thing," I said, my voice carrying a weight that demanded attention. "I haven't accepted the offer yet." Jennifer leaned forward, her expression intense. "Why not?" "That sounds like an incredible opportunity." "Because," I said, looking directly at Dad, "despite everything, part of me still hoped that my family might eventually see me as someone worth loving and respecting. Part of me thought that maybe if I achieved enough success, earned enough recognition, proved my worth sufficiently, you might finally treat me like I belonged here." The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of years of unspoken longing. I could see the impact they were having on everyone at the table, the way they forced a reckoning with family dynamics that had been allowed to persist unchallenged for too long. "But tonight," I continued, "Dad answered a question I didn't even realize I was still asking. He told me exactly how this family would feel if I disappeared from your lives, and that clarity is actually a gift." Dad's face had gone ashen, and I could see him beginning to understand the connection between his cruel words and the life-changing decision I was facing. "Michelle, what I said earlier was honest," I finished. "Maybe more honest than you intended to be, but honest nonetheless. And honesty is what this family has been lacking for years." I looked around the table one more time, taking in the faces of people who had shaped my understanding of love and worth, for better and worse. "So thank you, Dad, for finally telling me the truth about how you see me. It makes my decision much easier." The envelope felt lighter in my hands now, its contents no longer a secret but a declaration of independence. I had come to this dinner hoping for validation and acceptance, but I was leaving with something more valuable: the knowledge that my worth wasn't dependent on their ability to recognize it. The conversation that followed would determine not just my future, but the future of our family relationships. And for the first time in my life, I felt ready for whatever came next. Part 3. The Unexpected Alliance. The tension in the dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife when my phone buzzed against the table. I glanced down to see Amanda's name on the screen, her text reading simply, "How's it going? Need an extraction?" The timing was so perfect I almost smiled despite everything. "Who's texting you at family dinner?" Mom asked, her voice strained as she clearly hoped for any distraction from the emotional minefield we'd been navigating. "Amanda," I said, setting the Kendix phone aside without responding. "She's checking to make sure I survived Christmas with you all." The casual way I said it seemed to land like another small blow. The implication that my best friend was actively concerned about my well-being around my own family. I could see Mom processing this information, her face cycling through hurt and something that might have been self-awareness. "She thinks we're dangerous?" Dad asked, attempting what I think was supposed to be a joke but coming across as defensive instead. "She thinks you're emotionally unavailable," I replied matter-of-factly. Which, after tonight, seems like a pretty accurate assessment. Emma cleared her throat nervously, and I could tell she was struggling with whether to speak up or stay out of what was clearly a family crisis decades in the making. Finally, she seemed to find her courage. "I have to say something," Emma began, her voice quieter than usual but determined. I've been listening to this whole conversation, and honestly, I'm shocked by some of the things I'm hearing. Uncle Tom looked at his daughter with surprise, clearly not expecting her to insert herself into what he probably considered an adult family matter. Emma, maybe this isn't. No, Dad, I think it is my business, Emma interrupted, her voice gaining strength. Michelle is my cousin, and I've watched how this family treats her for years without really understanding what I was seeing. But listening to her tonight, I'm realizing that I've been witnessing something really unfair. She turned to look at me directly, her young face serious with conviction. Michelle, do you remember my high school graduation party 3 years ago? I nodded, curious where she was going with this memory. You were the only family member who asked me about my college plans, Emma continued. Not just which school I was attending, but what I wanted to study, and why. You spent an hour talking to me about different career paths in marketing and graphic design, giving me real advice about building a portfolio and finding internships. She looked around the table at the adults who were watching this exchange with varying degrees of discomfort. Meanwhile, everyone else spent the party talking about Jennifer's latest case or Dad's retirement plans, or Aunt Linda's garden renovation. I was the guest of honor at my own graduation party, and the only person who treated me like my future mattered was Michelle. The observation hit the room like a small explosion. I could see the adults processing Emma's words, recognizing the truth in her assessment of that gathering, and probably dozens of others like it. That's not the only time, Emma continued, warming to her subject with the fearlessness that comes from being 22 and still believing the world can be fair if people just try hard enough. At Christmas 2 years ago, when I was really struggling with my senior year course load and having panic attacks about graduation, Michelle was the one who talked me through it. She shared strategies for managing anxiety and recommended a therapist who really helped me. She looked directly at her parents now, her voice carrying a note of gentle accusation. You all knew I was struggling that semester, but no one thought to ask Michelle for advice, even though she'd been dealing with similar issues. Instead, you just told me to push through it and stay positive. Uncle Tom's face flushed with embarrassment, and I could see him remembering that difficult period when Emma had been calling home in tears multiple times a week. We didn't know Michelle had experience with anxiety treatment. Because you never asked her about anything personal, Emma replied simply. You never asked what she'd learned in therapy, or how she'd developed coping strategies, or whether she might have insights that could help someone else in the family. The truth of this was so obvious once Emma said it that I could see it registering on everyone's faces. Here I was, someone who'd spent 2 years working with a therapist to develop healthy coping mechanisms for anxiety and depression, and my family had treated my mental health journey as something private and slightly shameful rather than a resource that might benefit others. Emma makes a good point, Aunt Carol said quietly, speaking for the first time since Dad's devastating comment had derailed the evening. We've all been so focused on celebrating traditional achievements that we've missed other kinds of wisdom and success. Mom was twisting her napkin in her hands, a nervous habit I'd noticed since childhood whenever she was processing uncomfortable truths. Michelle, we didn't know you'd been struggling with depression. If we'd known, you would have done what? I asked, not unkindly but with genuine curiosity. Would you have asked about my treatment? Would you have wanted to understand what triggered my depression, or how I was working to overcome it? Or would you have just worried that it was another sign that I wasn't handling my life as well as Jennifer handles hers? The question hung in the air because we all knew the answer. Mental health struggles didn't fit the family narrative of success and achievement that had been carefully cultivated over the years. They would have been seen as evidence of personal failure, rather than a common human experience that required courage and resources to address. I think I would have tried to fix you, Mom admitted finally, her voice small with the recognition of her own limitations. I would have wanted to solve the problem rather than understand it. It was perhaps the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. And I felt a tiny crack appear in the wall of resentment I'd built over the years. Not enough to change everything, but enough to let in a sliver of light. The thing is, I said, sitting back down and placing the letter on the table in front of me, my depression wasn't something that needed to be fixed. It was a natural response to years of feeling fundamentally unseen and unvalued by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and I could see her struggling with the implications of what I was saying. Michelle, that's not fair. We do love you. Do you? I asked, meeting her eyes directly. Or do you love the idea of having a sister? Because loving someone requires knowing them, and none of you have shown any interest in knowing who I actually am. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my photo gallery, finding the picture I'd taken at the gallery opening where I'd met Tyler. It showed me standing next to one of my pieces that had been selected for a local artist showcase, my face glowing with pride and accomplishment. This was taken 8 months ago at an art gallery in downtown Denver, I said, turning the phone so everyone could see the image. My work was featured in a group show of emerging Colorado artists. It was one of the proudest moments of my professional life. I scrolled to the next photo, which showed Tyler and me at the opening reception, both of us dressed up and clearly celebrating. This is also where I met Tyler, the man I've been dating for 8 months and am deeply in love with. The man you've met exactly twice, because family gatherings make him uncomfortable after witnessing how I'm treated here. The photos seemed to hit my family like evidence from a trial they didn't know they were part of. Here was proof of achievements and relationships and moments of joy that they knew nothing about, despite the fact that I'd been living these experiences less than an hour away from their daily lives. You never told us about the gallery show, Dad said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been hurt. I did tell you, I replied calmly. I called Mom the week before the opening and mentioned that I had a piece in a local art show. She said, "That's nice, honey," and immediately changed the subject to talk about Jennifer's engagement party planning. Mom's face crumpled as the memory came back to her, and I could see her recognizing the dismissive way she'd handled what should have been a moment of shared celebration. I also invited all of you to the opening, I continued. I sent a group text with the gallery information and the date. Jennifer replied that she had a work dinner, Dad didn't respond at all, and Mom said she'd try to make it, but never followed up. The evidence was mounting, piece by piece, creating a picture of systematic exclusion and dismissal that was becoming impossible to deny. I wasn't being dramatic or oversensitive. I was documenting a pattern of behavior that had persisted for years. So the opening night came and went, I said, scrolling through more photos from that evening. I sold 2 pieces, met the man I'm falling in love with, and had one of the best nights of my adult life. And none of you were there to witness it because none of you thought it was important enough to prioritize. Kevin, who had been silent throughout most of this exchange, finally spoke up. Michelle, I think you're being a little harsh. Everyone has busy schedules and competing priorities. I turned to look at him, this man who had been part of our family gatherings for 3 years, but had never once made an effort to have a real conversation with me. Kevin, what do you do for work? The question seemed to catch him off guard. I'm in investment banking with Morrison Stanley. And how did you get interested in finance? I asked, following up as if this were a normal getting-to-know-you conversation. I studied economics in college and did internships with several firms before finding my niche in investment strategies, he replied, clearly confused about where this was going. That's interesting, I said. Now let me ask you something else. What do I do for work? Kevin's face went blank, and I could see him scrambling for information he'd never bothered to absorb. You're an artist? I'm a graphic designer, I corrected gently. I create visual communications for businesses and organizations. But you've never asked me about my work in 3 years of family gatherings, so I'm not surprised you don't know the specifics. The point was made without malice, but it was devastating nonetheless. Here was evidence that even the newest member of our family had absorbed the collective disinterest in my life and career. Furthermore, I continued, you just defended the family's busy schedules and competing priorities, but let me ask you this. How many of Jennifer's work events have you all attended? How many times has everyone rearranged their schedules to support her achievements? The question was met with silence because the answer was obvious. Jennifer's law firm parties, her court case celebrations, her bar association events, her networking dinners. The family had shown up for all of them, treating her professional life as a series of shared victories worthy of collective support. The difference isn't that Jennifer's events are more important. I said quietly. The difference is that Jennifer's achievements are seen as reflecting well on the family, while mine are seen as personal hobbies that don't require community support. Emma was nodding along with my analysis, her face showing the recognition that comes from finally understanding a pattern you've witnessed but never consciously processed. It's like there are two different standards operating in this family, she said. One for Jennifer and one for everyone else. That's not true, Jennifer protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I don't ask for special treatment. You don't have to ask for it, I replied. It's been the default setting for so long that everyone, including you, has stopped noticing it. Your successes become family celebrations. Your challenges become family rallying points. Your announcements become the centerpiece of gatherings like this one. I gestured around the dining room, where Jennifer's engagement announcement had indeed dominated the entire evening until Dad's cruel comment had shifted the focus. Meanwhile, my successes go unnoticed, my challenges are handled in private, and my announcements don't get made because no one expects me to have anything worth sharing. The pattern I was describing was so entrenched and so obvious once named that I could see everyone struggling to process how they'd participated in it for so long without conscious awareness. It's not malicious, I continued, my voice gentler now. I don't think anyone set out to create a hierarchy of worth within this family, but impact doesn't require intent, and the impact has been that I've felt like a peripheral figure in my own family for most of my adult life. Uncle Tom was looking increasingly uncomfortable, and I could tell he was grappling with the possibility that similar dynamics might exist in his own relationship with Emma. Michelle, what can we do to change this? How do we move forward from here? It was a good question, and one I'd been asking myself throughout months of therapy as I tried to understand whether repair was possible or if distance was the healthier choice. I honestly don't know, I admitted. Change requires acknowledging that there's a problem, and then it requires consistent effort over time to develop new patterns. It's not something that can be fixed with an apology or a single conversation. I looked around the table at faces that were showing varying degrees of comprehension and remorse. What I do know is that the Morrison Creative Group offer has a deadline. I need to give them an answer by January 15th, which means I have 3 weeks to decide whether to stay in Denver and continue hoping this family will eventually see me as someone worth their attention, or to move to Chicago and build a life surrounded by people who already recognize my value. The ultimatum wasn't intended as manipulation, but as a statement of reality. I had reached a point in my life where I could no longer afford to wait for other people's approval or recognition. Either this family was willing to do the work necessary to build genuine relationships with me, or I was willing to build a life without them. Michelle, Mom said, her voice thick with emotion, we don't want you to move to Chicago. We want you here, as part of this family. Then show me, I replied simply. Don't tell me you want me here. Show me through your actions that I'm valued and seen and appreciated for who I actually am, not who you think I should be. The challenge was clear, and I could see everyone processing what that might look like in practical terms. It would mean asking about my work with genuine interest, celebrating my achievements with the same enthusiasm they showed for Jennifer's, including Tyler in family gatherings as a welcome addition rather than an awkward obligation. Most importantly, it would mean recognizing that love isn't just a feeling but a series of choices, and they would need to choose to see me, know me, and value me consistently over time. I want to try, Emma said suddenly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. I want to be the kind of family member you deserve, Michelle, and I want to learn from the mistakes I've watched everyone else make. Her words carried the weight of generational change, the possibility that patterns could be broken and new ways of loving could be learned. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning. The letter from Morrison Creative Group sat on the table between us, representing both an opportunity and an ultimatum. In 3 weeks, I would have to decide whether to bet on my family's capacity for change, or to choose the certainty of a fresh start in a new city. For the first time in my life, the choice was entirely mine to make. The silence that followed Emma's declaration stretched for what felt like an eternity. I could see my family members processing not just her words, but the implications of everything that had been said in the past hour. The carefully constructed facade of our holiday gathering had crumbled, leaving us all sitting in the wreckage of years of unexamined family dynamics. It was Jennifer who broke the silence, her voice uncharacteristically small. "Michelle, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I nodded, curious about what had shifted in her perspective to prompt such a vulnerable request. "Do you hate me?" she asked, her perfectly composed exterior finally showing cracks. "Because listening to everything you've said tonight, I'm realizing that my success might have come at the cost of your happiness, and I never even noticed." The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of the genuine distress in her voice. Jennifer looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of understanding her role in family dynamics was physically diminishing her presence in the room. "I don't hate you," I said honestly, watching relief flood her features. "But I do resent the way your achievements have been used as a measuring stick for my worth. I resent that loving you seemed to require diminishing me. And I resent that it took me standing up at this dinner table to get anyone to consider that maybe there was room in this family for two successful daughters." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, I saw my sister as a person rather than a symbol of everything I wasn't. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear to you, Michelle, I didn't know that my success was making you feel invisible." "I believe you," I replied, "and I meant it. But Jen, not knowing doesn't erase the impact. And part of not knowing was choosing not to see what was happening right in front of you." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I could see him struggling with the realization that his parenting had created a dynamic where one daughter's success had come at the emotional expense of the other. "Michelle, your sister worked very hard for her achievements. We were proud of her efforts." "I worked hard too, Dad," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I worked just as hard, just in a different field with different metrics for success. But my efforts were never celebrated or even acknowledged because they didn't fit your definition of achievement." I pulled out my phone again and scrolled to a photo I'd been saving for this moment. It showed me at the Denver Art Museum, standing next to a large display featuring my design work for their new membership campaign. The professional lighting made the display look impressive and important, which it was. "This is from last month," I said, turning the phone toward the table. The Denver Art Museum unveiled my membership campaign design to their board of directors and major donors. It was a presentation to over 200 people, including some of the most influential cultural leaders in Colorado. I watched their faces as they took in the image, seeing me in a professional context that commanded respect and recognition. This wasn't a small local art show or a personal hobby project. This was major institutional work that required sophisticated skills and carried significant responsibility. The campaign I designed is projected to increase museum membership by 30% over the next 2 years, I continued. That translates to approximately $400,000 in additional revenue for one of Denver's most important cultural institutions. The numbers seemed to hit Dad particularly hard, and I could see him recalculating his assumptions about the significance and financial impact of my work. This wasn't just creative expression. This was strategic business communication with measurable results. The museum director told me it was the most effective membership design they'd ever implemented, I said, scrolling to another photo that showed me shaking hands with the director at the unveiling event. She asked if I'd be interested in designing their annual fundraising gala materials for next year. Mom was staring at the photos with an expression I'd rarely seen from her, genuine pride mixed with regret. "Michelle, this is incredible work. Why didn't you tell us about such a major achievement?" "I did tell you," I said gently. "I called you the day I got the contract and said I'd been hired by the art museum for a big project. You said, 'That's wonderful, honey,' and then spent 15 minutes telling me about Jennifer's latest case victory." The pattern was so consistent and so documented that it was becoming impossible to deny. Every attempt I'd made to share professional success had been met with polite dismissal followed by enthusiastic discussion of Jennifer's parallel achievements. "I also invited you to the unveiling event," I continued. "I sent you the invitation with a note saying it would mean a lot to me if you could attend. Dad, you said you had a principals meeting that night. Mom, you said you were having dinner with your book club." I scrolled to a photo from that evening showing the elegant reception that had followed the presentation, with dozens of well-dressed attendees celebrating the launch of the campaign. It turned out to be one of the most important networking events of my career. I met 3 potential clients and was introduced to the director of the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center, who has since hired me for their rebranding project. The missed opportunities were stacking up, each one representing not just a moment of personal celebration that my family had chosen to skip, but professional connections and career advancement that they could have supported if they'd understood the significance of what I was doing. Kevin was looking at the photos with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Michelle, I had no idea your work was at this level. This looks like major commercial design work." "It is major commercial design work," I replied, "but none of you have ever asked to see my portfolio, or visited my website, or shown any curiosity about the scope and quality of my professional output." I turned to Jennifer, who was still processing the implications of everything she'd been hearing. "Jen, you've known me for 26 years. Can you tell me the name of a single client I've worked with in the past 2 years? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, her face flushing with embarrassment as she realized she couldn't answer the question. "Can you tell me what kind of design work I specialize in? What my rates are? Whether I work primarily with nonprofits or for-profit businesses? Whether I freelance exclusively, or if I've been considering full-time positions?" Each question was met with silence, and I could see Jennifer understanding that despite living in the same city and attending monthly family dinners together, she knew virtually nothing about my professional life. "But I can tell you everything about your career," I continued. "I know you specialize in corporate law with a focus on mergers and acquisitions. I know you made partner earlier than anyone expected because of your work on the Morrison Industries deal. I know you bill at $400 an hour and that you're being considered for the youngest ever partnership position in your firm's history." The contrast was stark and undeniable. While I'd been paying attention to her achievements and celebrating her success, she'd been completely unaware of my professional development and accomplishments. "That's not fair," Jennifer protested weakly. "You never talk about your work in detail." "Because every time I try, the conversation gets redirected," I replied. "Watch this." I turned to Dad with the kind of enthusiastic energy I used to bring to family dinners before I learned it was pointless. "Dad, I'm so excited about this new project I'm working on. I'm redesigning the entire brand identity for a tech startup that's developing renewable energy solutions. It's exactly the kind of work that combines creative challenge with meaningful social impact." Dad nodded politely, clearly trying to show interest but struggling to engage with content that fell outside his comfort zone. "That sounds nice, Michelle. And now watch what happens when Jennifer shares professional news," I said, turning to my sister. "Jen, tell Dad about any recent case you've been working on." Jennifer looked uncomfortable with the demonstration, but she played along. "Well, I just closed a deal that saved our client about $12 million in potential litigation costs." Dad's face immediately lit up with genuine interest and pride. "12 million? That's incredible, Jennifer. Tell me more about how you structured the agreement." The difference in response was so obvious that it seemed to shock everyone at the table, including Dad himself. His body language, tone of voice, and level of engagement shifted completely when discussing Jennifer's work versus mine, even though both involved complex problem-solving and significant financial implications. "Do you see it now?" I asked quietly. "It's not that I don't share details about my work. It's that my work doesn't generate the same level of interest or pride, so conversations about it die quickly while conversations about Jennifer's career flourish and expand." Uncle Tom was nodding slowly, his face showing the recognition that comes from seeing a pattern you've been unconsciously perpetuating. "I think I do this with Emma too," he admitted. "I show more enthusiasm for certain topics than others, and I never realized how that might affect which stories she chooses to share with me." Emma squeezed her father's hand, clearly appreciating his willingness to acknowledge the dynamic. "It's okay, Dad. The important thing is recognizing it so we can do better." But I wasn't finished with my demonstration. I had one more revelation that would complete the picture of just how thoroughly I'd been overlooked and underestimated by my own family. "There's something else you should know about the Morrison Creative Group offer," I said, picking up the letter from the table. "It didn't come out of nowhere. They've been recruiting me for 6 months. This seemed to surprise everyone, and I could see them processing the implications of a 6-month recruitment process by a prestigious firm. It started when their creative director saw my Denver Art Museum campaign and reached out through LinkedIn. I continued. We had coffee in May, then a formal interview in June, then a portfolio review in July. They flew me to Chicago in August for a day-long interview with their entire creative team. Mom's eyes widened at the mention of the Chicago trip. You went to Chicago for a job interview? I did, I confirmed. I took a long weekend and flew out for what turned out to be 8 hours of presentations, portfolio reviews, and strategic discussions about their creative direction. It was one of the most intense and rewarding professional experiences of my career. I scrolled through my phone to find photos from that trip, showing me in Morrison Creative Group's sleek Chicago offices, presenting my work to a conference room full of industry professionals. The images told a story of someone operating at the highest levels of their field, commanding respect and serious consideration from major players in the industry. They put me up at the Four Seasons and took me to dinner at one of Chicago's best restaurants, I said, showing them a photo of the elegant meal that had capped off the interview day. The creative director told me they'd never had a candidate present such a comprehensive understanding of brand strategy, combined with exceptional execution skills. The level of professional respect and recognition I was describing clearly shocked my family, who had never seen my work as anything more than a creative hobby with modest commercial applications. In September, they made their initial offer, I continued. Senior creative director with a team of 12 designers and a budget of over $2 million for annual projects. But I asked for time to consider it because part of me still hoped that my family might eventually recognize my success and want to be part of celebrating it. Dad's face had gone pale as he processed the magnitude of what I was describing. This wasn't just a job offer. It was recognition at the highest levels of my industry, the kind of career opportunity that represented decades of skill development and professional achievement. In October, they increased the offer, I said, pulling out a second letter from my purse. $160,000 plus performance bonuses that could bring my total compensation to over $200,000 in the first year. The salary figures seemed to hit everyone like physical blows. Even in Jennifer's successful legal career, she hadn't reached that level of compensation until her 3rd year as a partner. They also offered a relocation package worth $30,000, 6 weeks of paid vacation, full health benefits, and profit sharing that could add another $15,000 to $20,000 annually, I continued. Plus opportunities for international project work with their London and Tokyo offices. Kevin was staring at me with what looked like genuine respect for the first time since I'd known him. Michelle, that's an extraordinary package. Morrison Creative Group is legendary in the design world. I know, I said simply. And they want me because they recognize what my own family has never bothered to see. That I'm exceptionally good at what I do. The words carried the weight of years of accumulated hurt, but also a new kind of strength. For the first time in my life, I was speaking about my professional value with confidence and clarity, no longer apologizing for my success or minimizing my achievements to make others comfortable. The final offer came last week, I said, pulling out a 3rd letter. They've now offered me a position as Director of Brand Strategy, which would make me the youngest person ever to hold that title in their company's 40-year history. I looked around the table at faces that were showing various stages of shock, pride, and regret. They want me to start February 1st, which means I'd be leaving right after Jennifer's wedding. The timing seems almost poetic, doesn't it? Her new beginning and mine, happening simultaneously. Jennifer was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the full scope of what had been happening, while she'd been focused on her own life and career. Michelle, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry that we missed all of this. I'm sorry too, I said, my voice gentle but firm. I'm sorry it took an ultimatum and a cruel comment from Dad to get anyone to pay attention to my life. I'm sorry I had to fight for recognition in my own family. And I'm sorry that my success story has been invisible to the people who should have been cheering the loudest. The dining room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different. It was the silence of people grappling with the magnitude of their collective blindness, the weight of opportunities missed, and celebrations that never happened. Dad finally spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. Michelle, what I said earlier about everyone being relieved if you died, that was the cruelest thing I've ever said to another human being, and certainly the cruelest thing I've ever said to my daughter. He paused, struggling to find words that could somehow bridge the gap between the devastating impact of his words and his apparent desire to repair the damage. I was wrong, he continued. Not just about what I said tonight, but about everything. I've been wrong about your career, wrong about your value, wrong about what kind of daughter and person you are, and I don't know how to fix 26 years of being wrong. It was perhaps the most honest and vulnerable I'd ever seen my father, and despite everything, I felt a crack appear in the wall of hurt I'd built around my heart. Part 5. A new beginning. Dad's admission hung in the air like incense, heavy with the weight of years that couldn't be undone but might, possibly, be forgiven. I looked at this man who had shaped my understanding of worth and love, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time as flawed and human, rather than an immovable force of disappointment. You can't fix 26 years, I said quietly. But you can choose how the next 26 years look. Mom reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, her touch tentative, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to comfort me anymore. What would that look like, sweetheart? How do we begin to repair this? I considered her question carefully, thinking about the conversations I'd had with my therapist about healthy boundaries and genuine change versus performative gestures. It starts with curiosity instead of judgment. It means asking about my life because you actually want to know the answer, not because you're checking a box for family obligations. Jennifer wiped her eyes with her napkin, leaving streaks of mascara that somehow made her look more real than she had all evening. I want to know everything, she said. I want to know about Tyler, and your work, and your gallery shows, and your therapy journey. I want to know my sister, not just the version of you I created in my head. That would mean a lot to me, I replied, feeling something shift in my chest where years of resentment had been stored. But Jen, it also means being okay with the fact that my life doesn't look like yours. That my success metrics are different, my timeline is different, my choices are different. She nodded emphatically. I'm starting to understand that my way isn't the only right way. Maybe it never was. Uncle Tom cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. Michelle, I owe you an apology too. I've been complicit in this family dynamic for years, and I've probably passed some of these same patterns down to Emma without realizing it. Emma squeezed her father's hand. We can do better, Dad. All of us can. The conversation that followed was unlike any our family had ever had. For the first time, we talked about feelings and patterns and the invisible rules that had governed our interactions for decades. Dad admitted that he'd felt threatened by creative pursuits because he didn't understand them, that he'd projected his own fears about financial security onto my career choices. Mom acknowledged that she'd been so focused on maintaining family harmony that she'd failed to notice when that harmony was costing one of her daughters her sense of belonging. As the evening wound down, I found myself faced with the decision I'd been postponing for weeks. The Morrison Creative Group offer sat on the table between us, representing two possible futures. One where I stayed and worked to rebuild these relationships, and one where I started fresh in a city where my value was already recognized and celebrated. I need to tell you all something, I said as we began, clearing the dessert plates that had gone largely untouched during our emotional reckoning. I haven't made my decision about Chicago yet, but tonight has clarified something important for me. Everyone stopped what they were doing, sensing the weight of what I was about to say. Whether I stay or go, I'm done waiting for other people to see my worth, I continued. I'm done making myself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for me. And I'm done accepting crumbs of attention when I deserve full meals of genuine interest and support. Dad nodded slowly, his face showing the acceptance of someone who understood that certain changes were non-negotiable. What can we do to show you that you deserve that support here? It was the first time he'd ever asked me what I needed instead of telling me what I should want, and the significance of that shift wasn't lost on me. Show up, I said simply. When I have a gallery opening or a client presentation or a milestone worth celebrating, show up. Ask questions about my work that go deeper than, how's business? Learn Tyler's last name and his favorite restaurant and what he does when he's not with me. Treat my achievements as worthy of the same enthusiasm you show for Jennifer's. I looked around the table at faces that were showing varying degrees of commitment and uncertainty. Most importantly, if I decide to stay in Denver, I need you to understand that our relationships will be different going forward. I won't be the accommodating daughter who absorbs criticism without pushback or accepts dismissal without consequence. Jennifer reached across the table and took my hand. I want that different relationship. I want a sister who challenges me and calls me out when I'm being selfish or oblivious. I want to know the strong, successful woman you've become instead of the shadow person I've been seeing all these years. Her words carried a sincerity I'd rarely heard from her, and I felt another crack appear in the defensive walls I'd built around my heart. As we finished cleaning up, Emma approached me in the kitchen where I was wrapping leftover dessert. "Michelle, can I ask you something personal?" I nodded, curious about what was on her young mind. "How did you find the courage to speak up tonight? I've been watching this family dynamic my whole life, but I never would have known how to address it the way you did." The question made me pause, thinking about the long journey that had led to this moment of truth-telling. Therapy helped, I said honestly, but mostly I reached a point where the pain of staying silent became greater than the fear of speaking up. When someone offers you a life where you're valued and celebrated, it becomes impossible to accept a life where you're tolerated and dismissed. Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I hope I can be that brave if I ever need to be." "You already are," I assured her. "You spoke up tonight when you didn't have to. You validated my experience when it would have been easier to stay quiet." That took real courage. An hour later, as Tyler and I sat in my apartment debriefing the evening over wine and leftover Chinese takeout, I felt exhausted but strangely hopeful. The conversation had been brutal in many ways, but it had also cleared the air of decades of unspoken resentment and misunderstanding. "So what are you thinking about Chicago?" Tyler asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way that told me he was trying not to influence my decision while clearly having strong feelings about it. "I'm thinking that for the first time in my life, I have real choices," I said, curling up against his side on the couch. "I can take an incredible job with a company that already sees my value. Or I can stay here and see if my family can learn to appreciate what they've been missing." Tyler was quiet for a moment, running his fingers through my hair in the soothing gesture that had become one of my favorite things about our relationship. "What does your gut tell you?" I considered the question, checking in with the instincts I'd been learning to trust through months of therapy and self-reflection. "My gut says that real change is possible, but it's going to take time and consistent effort from everyone involved. It says that my family's shock tonight was genuine, and their regret feels real." I paused, thinking about Dad's broken expression when he'd apologized, about Jennifer's tears when she'd realized how much of my life she'd missed, about Emma's fierce loyalty and Mom's tentative but determined efforts to bridge the gap between us. "It also says that I don't have to choose between professional success and family relationships," I continued. "Morrison Creative Group will still exist in a year or two, if Denver doesn't work out. But this opportunity to rebuild my family relationships might not." Tyler tightened his arms around me, and I could feel his relief at my decision before I'd even fully made it myself. "Whatever you choose, I'll support. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't hoping you'd give them a chance to do better." The next morning I woke up with unusual clarity about what I needed to do. I spent an hour crafting an email to Morrison Creative Group, thanking them for their extraordinary offer, and asking if they'd be willing to table the position for 1 year while I handled some family commitments in Denver. I explained that I was deeply honored by their interest, and hoped we might revisit the opportunity in the future. Their response came within hours, expressing disappointment but understanding, and indicating that they'd absolutely be interested in reconnecting when my personal situation allowed for a move. The creative director included a personal note saying that my integrity in handling family obligations only reinforced their belief that I'd be an exceptional addition to their team when the timing was right. That afternoon, I called my family to let them know about my decision to stay in Denver. The conversations were awkward but heartfelt, full of promises and commitments that would take months to prove genuine but felt like important first steps. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Dad started asking detailed questions about my current projects and listening to the answers with genuine interest. Mom visited my website and spent an hour going through my portfolio, calling afterward to tell me how proud she was of work she'd never bothered to examine before. Jennifer and Kevin invited Tyler and me to dinner at their house, treating us like a couple whose relationship mattered rather than an obligation to be endured. Most surprisingly, Jennifer asked if she could attend my next client presentation, saying she wanted to understand what I did for work beyond the vague descriptions she'd been accepting for years. Watching her witness my professionalism and expertise in a business setting seemed to fundamentally shift how she saw me as a person. The changes weren't dramatic or immediate, but they were consistent. Small gestures of curiosity and inclusion that gradually built into something that felt like genuine family connection. For the first time in my adult life, I felt seen and valued by the people who had raised me. 6 months later, as I stood in my parents' backyard at a barbecue celebrating my latest contract victory, I watched Tyler deep in conversation with Dad about architecture and urban planning. Jennifer was showing Emma some of my designs on her phone, explaining the strategic thinking behind my creative choices, with the enthusiasm of someone who had taken the time to understand my work. Mom approached me with a glass of wine and a smile that reached her eyes. "I have something for you," she said, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. Inside was a silver picture frame, simple and elegant, with a photo from my Denver Art Museum presentation. It showed me pointing to my displayed work, confident and professional and clearly in my element. "I asked the museum for a copy," Mom explained. "I wanted to have a picture that shows you the way you deserve to be seen." As I looked at the photo, I realized that the woman in the image was someone I'd become despite my family's limitations, not because of their support, but perhaps, with time and effort, she was also someone they could learn to see and celebrate. The choice to stay in Denver hadn't been about forgiveness or family loyalty. It had been about believing that people could grow, that patterns could change, and that love could be learned even when it didn't come naturally. Standing in that backyard, surrounded by conversations that included me rather than simply tolerating my presence, I felt something I'd been searching for my entire life. The certainty that I belonged exactly where I was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.